Please give a warm welcome to Scott Rao.
Thank you. By a show of hands, how many people here have used a refractometer before? Okay. For the people who haven't, I just want to give a brief rundown as to what it is, what it does, and then we'll get into this. So it's a really simple device. All it does is tell you the strength of your coffee. And it measures the coffee strength in something called total dissolved solids, or TDS. And so for instance, if you brew an espresso, it might say something like 10 or 11%. And what that means is that your espresso, if it's 10% coffee solids were dissolved in your brew, and the other 90% pretty much is water. So a filter coffee might measure something like 1.4%, so you've got about 98.6% water, 1.4% coffee stuff. So it's nice to know the strength of your brew, but that's not really the point. The point is that if you weigh the grounds that you use, and you weigh the brew that you make, and then you also know your TDS, you can then calculate the extraction. And the extraction means what percentage of the coffee grounds weight ended up in the cup. And this is important because nothing is better correlated with flavor than extraction level. Now, that's not to say that 2 cups at 19% taste identical, but it's a very critical number in trying to figure out how a coffee might taste. And if you do a good job of extracting from the coffee grounds uniformly, and you get 19 at a certain temperature, and then a week from now you do the same thing and you get 19 at that temperature, you can rest assured the coffees are going to taste incredibly similar. So the point of the refractometer is ultimately to tell you how much did you extract, and if you measure thousands of brews over time and you taste them, you will start noticing the correlation with flavor and extraction. And eventually you get to the point where when you're familiar with a grinder, you can taste the coffee out of it and you can say, this is about 19.5%. And that's very powerful, because when you're a barista and you know those numbers, you know how they taste, then situations will arise, whether you're working on different equipment, whether you're using a new coffee or whatever. Like, having that data point and that relationship in your experience really helps you predict what will happen, and it helps you diagnose problems that may have happened. So when the refractometer for coffee first came out, the reception from the coffee industry was rather mixed. A lot of people were angered by it. A lot of people felt threatened by it. A lot of people just said things like, why do I need a machine to tell me when my coffee is good? And things like that. And I understand that perspective. The point is that, it's just a tool. And like many tools, if you use it wisely, it makes you better, it makes you more consistent. Sometimes it makes things a lot easier. So it's not there to dictate to you. It's there to supplement your experience and your knowledge in a way that makes you ultimately better at your craft. So if you're someone who's used a dozen grinders and you've measured and tasted 5,000 different coffees with those grinders, and then you go and you get this new experience, like, you have this awesome rich background of numbers and flavors and grinders and experience that you can sort of all wrap together, and sort of immediately you'll say, I know what I need to do to make this better. I know I need to go in this direction, that kind of thing. And that's pretty powerful. So if a lot of people get refractometers, they get very hooked on the numbers, and they actually forget that they should taste the coffee, almost. And that's one extreme. And the other extreme is the people who think that measurement is worthless. So, but I think you have to accept that both the tasting and the measurement are both important. So if you taste all the time and you never measure, it's a little bit blind, because as I'll show you in a minute, you might taste the coffee and you might think it's good, and you might not be realizing how much better it could have been. And the refractometer can help you with that. Likewise, if you get hooked on the measurement and you forget that the taste is what matters in the end, it's a little bit artless. Like, then you get to become this robot, and sometimes you miss the sweet spots and the really beautiful things in the coffee, because you just think, this number has to be right. So let's say you're a barista, you come into a cafe in the morning and you dial in your espresso machine. Now let's say that you pull a few shots and your coffee is a little bit flat and woody, maybe flat and dull. So if you look at this graph at that little valley where it says flat and dull, let's say you didn't measure, but let's just say that I tell you that extraction was about 17%, which is often with a lot of grinders a very kind of flat zone. Okay. Now you're the barista and you say, I could change my dose, I could change my grind, I could change the amount of water, and you make a decision, and that decision happens to send you up towards 15 to 16%. So you basically, maybe you're grinding coarser, or maybe you're running less water through the grounds. And you think, this tastes light and fruity, I like this. You kind of pat yourself on the back, You open the shop and you think you've done a good job. What you may not know is that extraction quality changes along that sort of extraction line, they're not linear. So it could be really good at 15.5, and it can get really dull at 17. And if you keep going finer, it could actually get great at 19.5. But if you never measure, you'll never know that map. And so it's like, I think everybody before measurement existed was a little confused about this and didn't really necessarily realize that this thing that I call the double hump existed. I think a few people did, but it was more like we kind of knew it existed, but we weren't really sure what it was and where it was and such. So that same barista had this person happened to have chosen a finer grind or running more water through the grounds, possibly could have ended up at a much better shot, but this person, he had no idea. So this is where measurements can become really helpful, because when you do it enough, you kind of know this pattern, and then, thank you, Kelly. Thanks. Very dramatic moment. Okay. So, where were we? Okay. So if you measure a lot, you know this pattern. You get the flat, dull shot. Somewhere in your intuition, you say, I know I need to extract more, and that's going to fix this problem. So that's one of the first and biggest lessons you can really learn with the refractometer, is that it's not so linear, it's not so simple. Are we ready with the tasting, or how far are we? Not 5 minutes? Okay, very good. So I kind of confess I don't love these charts. I find them very confusing. So don't be intimidated by all the things on the screen. The gist of it is that diagonal green line represents a water to grounds ratio. So let's say you choose something like 17:1, meaning that the water, for every 17 grams of water, you're using 1 gram of coffee grounds. Once you've chosen that ratio, your extraction and strength are going to land somewhere on that line. If you choose the ratio differently, the diagonal line will shift. Okay, so we're on that line. We make a shot, or whatever we're brewing here, and we end up at that red dot. And the red dot says we've extracted at about 19% and about 1.25 strength. So all this really tells you, it tells you where you are on this map, and it also tells you that if you grind a little finer, you're going to climb up that green line. And if you grind a little coarser, you're going to go down the green line. So basically, once you've chosen a ratio, strength and extraction go in lockstep up and down. So it's actually a really simple thing. It looks a little confusing. Those boxes are recommended zones from various coffee organizations. So SCAE would recommend the green box, SCAA recommends the blue box, and the purple one, this graph was invented by, well, it was updated, shall we say, by Vince Fideli, who used to work for George Howell Coffee Company, and now he has VST, and that was sort of their target zone, was the purple box. So any questions so far? Okay. So I'm sorry for the math. This is the other way to look at how to look at extraction. There is an app for the phone, which is wildly popular because most people don't like doing math. The app is great. You don't necessarily need it. You can also just use a simple calculation. And the way it works is that you take your TDS number, you take your strength, and you multiply it by how much coffee you brewed, in the case of drip coffee or espresso. And the result is the extracted mass. So in this case, if you had a shot and your TDS is 11%, like it says, and your brewed coffee, your shot weight basically was 40 grams, 11% times 40 grams is 4.4 grams. So what that means is that you started out with 20 grams in the portafilter basket, 4.4 grams of that dissolved into your cup, okay? And now we take that extracted mass, we divide it by the dry dose of 20, and we end up with an extraction percent, which was 22. So it's actually pretty simple. If you really, really hate math, just forget this completely and use the app, it'll still work. But this is the gist of how it works. Technical note for those of you who use the app, you might try this and you might say, my calculation is a couple of tenths of a percent off of what this gives me. And that's because the app has some preset parameters for carbon dioxide and moisture content of the grounds, which you can choose. And when you take them off of 0, it moves the calculation a bit. It's kind of a trivial point. It's not that important. What is important is whether you use certain presets or whether you just leave them at 0 and do it this way, that you're just consistent. Because the bad news is that if you're measuring extractions and your friend at some other cafe with a different grinder is measuring extractions, your numbers may not agree. Okay, and that's not a bad thing. It's not a problem. It just makes it a little more complicated. So if your friend says, oh, with my grinder and such, I love this coffee at 19.5, and you're saying, well, I'm using the same coffee with a different setup and I'm loving it at 20%. It could be the grinder, because the grind particle size distribution kind of affects what the best extraction is. And it could also be that you're measuring with slightly different presets and the numbers should come out differently. So there is no universal in the industry. Nobody's ever going to come to you and say 20.2% is the best extraction for all coffees or for any particular coffee. That's not possible to say, because even with the same grinder, as the burrs get dull, your ideal extraction level will shift. So there's a lot of moving parts. So again, that doesn't invalidate all this, just makes it a little bit complicated and hazy, but if you just forget all that and you say, with my grinder in my shop, I am going to stay internally consistent with my measurements and what I like, then you'll be great. Okay, any questions on that? Because I know that's a little bit confusing. Okay. This is the boring part. It'll get better in a moment. So there's some simple benefits to using a refractometer. So the obvious thing is you taste the coffee, you measure it, and you find out what extraction level you tend to think tastes best with your equipment. The great thing really is that you start learning how different factors will affect the best extraction. So for instance, if you want to know how much does, tamping harder, does it make a difference? Does using a different temperature make a difference? Does using a tamper that fits better make a difference? Does using different pressure make a difference? There's so many things like that, and what's great is that the refractometer can help you learn and quantify exactly how much those things change extraction. So that was something that, for years before the refractometer, everybody was assuming how much those things mattered, but it was always kind of hazy. But now you can basically say, yeah, I switched my tamper from a 58.0 to a 58.4. My extractions went a little bit higher. They became more consistent. Obviously, something good is going on there. And you could say how much, and you can quantify it. So that's really powerful. Likewise, you don't have to guess anymore about how much temperature matters. Okay, I'm going to take a break for a second. It'll be a little chaotic. On each table, there is a tray with cups labeled A, B, and C. Basically, A is representing a slightly under-extracted coffee, B is representing a pretty well-extracted coffee, and C is slightly over-extracted. The bad news is they're actually really close. Like, this is actually one of those things where it's not as obvious as I would have liked it to have been, but that's kind of what we got. So anyway, give it a taste. There's one little cup for every person, and then come on back, and we'll keep going. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to begin again. Thank you. It's always fascinating with these things when a whole bunch of people go to taste. It's like putting animals back in their natural habitat. Everyone's like, oh yes, I'm tasting coffee and talking about it. I don't want to move. That's all I want to do. And it's like everyone gets so comfortable. Somebody want to tell me something about the cups that they tasted? And what's that? Sorry, raise a hand, talk loudly, somebody. Okay, perfect.
Where was it?
I don't know. You might want to say something. Yeah? Yeah? Yeah, C was definitely...
C is over-extracted.
C was unpleasant. Now, I readily accept that some people will like A better than B. Certainly in the world of third wave, the sourness in A was something that a lot of people actually like. I'm not a big fan of that. But did anybody prefer A over B? Or did people generally prefer B? I don't know. Okay, all right. C? Okay. I'm sorry? Yeah, Italians will like C. Yeah, I've learned that in the last 2 weeks, yes. Yeah. I could have thrown a little Verbusta in there just to make you really happy, but sorry. Okay, so the real point is this. Again, I actually don't care what people like or don't like. I just want people to be happy with the coffee they drink. But by measuring, you kind of get to predict what's going on and get to zero in on something. And if you decided, for instance, you liked B, and I tell you that B was 21% out of an EK grinder, that's something that you can kind of keep in mind and you can kind of target yourself, that kind of thing. And when you do it a lot, it becomes very easy. So one little interesting thing, so I bought an EK grinder 6 years ago and started using it because it seemed very promising. And what was interesting is that the refractometer that was the most important day for me to have a refractometer, because I started brewing and I kept going finer and finer, and I wasn't getting the astringency and bitterness that I expected, and the coffee got better and better all the way up to 23%. And that was fascinating. That was great. That was like a find, okay? But what was also really interesting that day was that every third or fourth brew, the number was way off. It would be like 23, 23, 23, 19. 23, 23, 23, 19. Like there was this weird thing happening and I didn't know why. Now, had I not had a refractometer, all I would have known was that there were good brews and bad brews and I was really just kind of lost. But the fact that I saw that pattern, I was like, okay, I know it's not the machine. I know it's not, like I kind of knew what it was and wasn't, but it really only could have been one thing. And I opened up the grinder and it turned out that the burrs were chipped in such a way that the chips seemed to have been participating at times and not other times. But what was nice was that the refractometer helped me within a couple of hours move to an extraction level that really nobody in specialty coffee had ever been at before and made good coffee. And then it also told me there was something wrong with my grinder simultaneously. So that was really powerful. And I mean, I hope I would have figured all those things out after a few weeks, but I figured it out in like 3 hours because the refractometer was just this, it gave a lot of leverage. It kind of really told explicitly what was going on. So it can actually be used to diagnose problems. Maybe you have a problem with your water and your water is a bad solvent and your extractions are low. Maybe you have a grinder that's like, I have a client who emailed me recently and he said, no matter what I do with my espresso, with an EK, I can't extract over 17%. So we went through everything in the world as far as, I even made him take little videos of everything he was doing so I could watch to make sure he wasn't doing something silly. And it turned out ultimately that the grinder itself had a defect where it was wobbling and that was inhibiting his extraction. But with the refractometer, it was great because we knew the EK was low, which was weird. We knew his Didding and his Nova Simile grinders were extracting at 21% with the same routine. So it allowed us to really hone in on what the culprit was, which was quite powerful. So this is an interesting graph. I think some of you have seen this before, but let's say you have a grinder and you put in some new burrs and you season them, and you find that on day one, the first shots you pull are best at about 21%. Now, that doesn't mean that for the rest of your life you should be targeting 21% with this grinder. What it means is that after a few weeks, you probably should be targeting something closer to 20.5%. And after a few months, you might be targeting something in the 19s. Because what happens is, as the burrs get duller, they produce more fines and also more large particles. And ultimately, if you try to extract at the same level all the time, those extra fines are going to add a lot of stringency and bitterness to your coffee. So it forces you to go a little bit lower in your extraction as the burrs wear in order to avoid the bitterness and astringency. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, this is one of those things where you can't just be a roaster and say, extract my Kenya at 19.5%, because you need to know what kind of grinder they're using and what kind of shape are the grinder burrs in. So again, this is one of those things, it's important to be internally consistent and know what's going on, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we can just make blanket statements to everybody about what numbers are best. Any questions on that? Okay. So this is kind of interesting too. These are the kind of things that, like after I had a refractometer for a few months, I was very lucky. The guy who makes it kind of gave me the first one. And so I got to play with it. I was like drunk on coffee for a month where I just probably measured like 3,000 or 4,000 coffees the first month to understand things. And so we came up with this, where basically like we had a Didding and we had an EK, bulk grinders. And we kind of mapped out the extraction levels and how we felt about them, and we kind of scored the quality, if you will, and learned that the Didding, we were liking it best in the mid-19s. They both had sharp burrs, for what it's worth. And we kind of come up with these curves of how the grinders tasted at different extraction levels. So again, this was one of those things where I felt like suddenly I was a much smarter coffee person because I had this information. And then after playing with lots and lots of grinders, since I'm a consultant, I'm forced basically to use different equipment every week and to seem like I know what I'm doing quickly. And so if I encounter a grinder I've already used before, great. Like I ask them how old the burrs are. I do a little estimate of, both a combination of where it is in the burr life, and then also what I know about that burr, and I can take a pretty good guess as to where we should be aiming for. And that helps me zero in a little faster. Any questions on that? Okay. So we've talked about using a refractometer to predict your ideal extraction. It also helps you know when to change the burrs, because you'll notice that, especially with espresso, your extraction will keep creeping down as the burrs get worn, and at some point you say, yeah, my 2-to-1 ratio of water to grounds, or like basically espresso shot weight to grounds, is getting down to about 18.5%, for instance, and you know with your grinder that that's kind of the point where you'd prefer to change the burrs. Now you can do that by taste, but it's also nice to have a number attached to it, because maybe you're not always around to do it personally, and other people might feel differently about it. And maybe you're a roaster with 20 different accounts who are all using a Mazzer grinder, and you can sort of advise everybody on the same thing. So it helps us kind of predict what's going on. Seasoning burrs. So the refractometer is very useful for learning how to season a grinder, because you buy a grinder, you ideally season the burrs before you use it, and this means you should put the grinder to the absolute finest setting and put a few kilos through on the finest setting in order to dull the burrs just a little bit. Because usually when they come from the factory, strangely enough, the grinder actually won't produce enough fines, and you'll get sort of fast flow and low extraction numbers. And if you do something like this, if you put a kilo through the grinder on the finest setting, and then you pull a shot, let's say like a ratio of say 18 grams of grounds to 36 grams of espresso shot weight, and you might note down 17%. You put another kilo through finest setting, and then you put it back to your kind of normal setting, and again you're at about 17%, and you do it and you get 17 and 17, and then suddenly after several kilos you get 17 and a half, 18, 18 and a half, 19, 19 and a half, and then it kind of stays at 19 and a half. That kind of tells you that you've now seasoned the burrs successfully. So years ago, there was this whole thing where people were seasoning raw burr E's with, I don't know, I heard crazy things like 150 pounds of coffee. That's a very expensive way to season a grinder. Might as well just buy a new grinder. But basically, I don't know, I think people were kind of freaked out that it took a lot of coffee to season it, and they didn't know how much to use. People were just overdoing it. But had they had this numerical information, somebody could have basically said, 25 kilos does the job with this particular grinder. With this other grinder, 4 kilos does the job, something like that. But the point is, it saves you money. It helps you be precise. If you know that your grinder takes 7 kilos in the finest setting to season, then for the rest of your life, every time you change the burrs, just put 7 kilos through in the finest setting and job done. Does anybody do that? Anybody use the number to okay, so cool. So everybody's learned something that can conceivably, yes? Well, you can use that to dull burrs, yes. I don't have a lot of experience with it, and I don't know at what rate the rice would do that, and I don't know how the rice would taste afterward or not. But what's that? Yeah, I mean, I know various people put various things through to do that. I'm sure that a lot of them are legitimate and work well. I personally just save like old coffee samples people give me I never wanted, terrible roasts, like whatever it is. Like I don't care if your coffee's 3 months old. It's not going to hurt your grinder. Just save old crap and put that in through seasoning. So we always had this giant cardboard box in the corner that was called seasoning coffees, and that was like some roaster did a terrible job, would send us samples, and we're like, in the seasoning box, that kind of thing. So if any of those roasters are here now, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay, so first of all, before I talk about something else, any refractometer questions, stories you want to relate, anything about that? Because I know I'm kind of whizzing through a lot. Yes?
Do we need to filter with the Immersion filter coffees from Chemex or
Okay. Cool, good question. So when you measure cupping or French press or espresso, you need to filter the brew in order to guarantee that your reading on the refractometer is accurate. These types of brewing methods leave a lot of undissolved solids in the coffee. Those undissolved solids can settle on the glass of the refractometer and muck up the refractive index that it reads. So the best advice I have is go to the VST website, download the instructions. It's very quick, really, and just read it like 10 times. Because I wish I did that in the beginning, because I read it once, and guys don't like to read instructions. So I read it, I was like, oh yeah, I get it, I know what I'm doing. And then for a few weeks, I was making some stupid mistake because I didn't read the instructions carefully, and then I talked to Vince, and he's like, what the fuck are you doing? I read the instructions, I'm like, oh yeah, sorry. So, but anyway, it's good to read the instructions, and maybe to print it out and reread them once in a while, because a lot of us kind of skip steps. When it comes to filtering, they sell these little plastic syringe filters. The unfortunate thing is that they're very expensive. They're very precise little filters. They filter down to 0.2 microns or some crazy thing like that, and that does a great job. Many people use other types of filtration to do the job, like doubling up AeroPress filters and that kind of thing. I've done it many times. I have very mixed feelings about it because it gets you in the ballpark, but it's not that accurate. So it's one of those things, it's like, I don't know if it's worth doing something that kind of gives you sketchy data that you're not 100% confident in. So definitely if you do it, you'll see the range of readings with the AeroPress filter will be like this wide, whereas the syringe filters will be like this. So.
Well, and the question was, what about the filter coffees?
So what's interesting is, let's say you make a V60 with a paper filter. Okay. You might say, well, if that's good enough, I don't have to post-filter it. I don't have to filter it again to put it in a refractometer. Then why can't I just make a French press and pour that through a V60 filter? Isn't that the same thing? But it's not. Because when you do an immersion brew, you get these colloids that are very hard to kind of break apart. And when you pour them through the paper filter, basically the paper filter doesn't catch all that it should. But when you make a V60, for instance, the coffee bed itself is a form of filtration, and it catches a lot of the fines and colloids and things, so the paper filter doesn't have to do, it has a very easy job, the paper filter. Whereas if you ask a plain paper filter to just catch all the crap in a French press or something like that, it's not going to be able to succeed well enough. Is that an okay answer? Am I answering your question?
Well, then if we brew Chemex, for example, which has the biggest paper one, so whenever Chemex extraction,
Uh-huh.
and okay with measuring it without a synergy filter.
Oh, so you've made a Chemex with a paper filter?
Well, no,
Or,
when we're measuring Chemex extraction,
yeah.
should we use the synergy filter,
No,
the
no.
expensive one?
No, so I have two answers to that. One is that you should never make Chemex. And the other, sorry. Where's Magda? Hi, Magda. Sorry, the other thing is that, so the coffee bed in the Chemex does a lot of filtration, and then the paper filter finishes the job good enough for the refractometer.
Yeah, okay.
And just to be clear, and I hope I'm answering your question properly, but if you made a French press and you poured it through a Chemex with the paper filter there, that's not good enough.
No.
Okay, yeah. So any,
V60
yeah,
all the filters.
yeah. So, okay. We good? Other questions?
We have time for questions after you finish, or however you like.
Okay. I just,
Yeah. So
I'm going to shift gears a bit to something unplanned. That's why I wanted questions on this before moving on to
Okay,
something else.
sure.
Yeah, it's, but you're in charge.
You have 15 minutes.
Kelly,
That's all
Kelly,
I care about.
Do you have any
really.
questions, Kelly?
Huh?
Do you have any questions?
I think I will.
I gotta say, last year at Barista Camp, so James Hoffman was sort of doing Kelly's job, and I did a talk on roasting, and James just kept asking questions, and they just got harder and harder and harder. And I was like trying to answer the questions. It was actually quite fun, but kind of hoping you'd torture me with questions.
I'm going to start soon, but
Okay,
I'll
okay.
let you
So,
brief a little bit more.
So this morning I was watching people brew with the bun, and we got to talking about batch brewing, and I realized that this is something I really want to talk about, because you can go apply it tomorrow at your cafe where you work. It's useful, it's very powerful, and it goes like this. A lot of people do batch brew by sort of playing with parameters, playing with grind, playing with ratios, and it's sort of like the old days with espresso where people are always messing with all the variables. But you need a little bit of a sound fundamental basis for why we're doing what we're doing and what the goals are when you make a filter brew, a batch brew. Okay? So unfortunately, all the different batch brew machines have different programming parameters to play with, so that gets a little bit tricky. I can't talk about all those. But what I can talk about is this. Here are what I think your goals should be when you do a batch brew. So you've chosen your ratio of grounds to water. Just stick with that. Don't mess with the ratio, okay? Be happy at 16:1 or 17:1 or whatever you're doing. Okay. The total contact time, meaning from the time that water starts spraying onto the grounds to the time that the flow from the brew basket breaks and turns into a drip. That's total contact time. That should be, ideally in my world, and you can obviously disagree, this is fine, but about 6 to 6.5 minutes. You can get a brilliant brew at 4.5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5.5 minutes, but I will say that you get more caramels, or you get sort of the optimal potential amount of caramels and sort of heavier, sweet, riper things going on when your total contact time is about 6 to 6.5 minutes. And a long contact time like this also technically allows you to use a little bit of a coarser grind, which is a good thing. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the grind in a second. So you choose some kind of extraction range. Let's say you choose you like 21%. You choose your brew strength 1.4. Use some ratio that can give you that, and you aim for this contact time of 6 to 6.5. And very importantly, and very few people accomplish this, but trust me, it really is what you should be looking for. The coffee bed at the end should be flat. If your coffee bed is climbing up the filter wall a bit, it means that you've created a relatively uneven extraction. The more stuff that goes up the walls, the less even your extraction is. So let's say the coffee bed is draining for the last 2 minutes of the brew cycle, and some grounds get left up on the wall. Let's say some of those grounds are out of the brew for the last 2 minutes. So the grounds at the bottom might be extracting for, say, 6 minutes, and the grounds up on the wall only extracted for 4 minutes. That's not a good thing. It's kind of like, imagine you made a French press, and at 4 minutes out of a 6-minute brew, you just arbitrarily decided to take 30% of the coffee out, the grounds out. Like, fine, your coffee might taste good in the end or such, but it was a strange way to make coffee, and you really don't want that to happen with your batch brew. So it's actually a little tricky to get this. You need to sort of play with your grind and your ratio and everything else to make all these things happen at once. If your grinder burrs get dull, it gets harder and harder to keep grounds off the walls. If your brew time is too short, it means that the slurry gets very high during brewing because water is pouring faster into the slurry, and it will be higher, and then it'll more likely have grounds settle on the wall. So there's a lot of moving parts you got to play with, but don't stop until you end up in a zone of 6.5 minutes total contact time and a flat bed and the extraction strength you want. Now, I'm going to tell you two things. One is that this will not work if your coffee bed is too shallow. Okay? So let's say you go out and you buy a Fetco or a bun, and it's designed to do up to 1.5 gallons, but you're a specialty coffee shop and you want to serve really fresh coffee, so you decide you're only going to brew 2 liters at a time into a nice little 2-liter pitcher, and you're going to try to turn it over quickly. That's very enviable, and that's great. But let's say your brew basket is designed to brew 4 to 6 liters. Your brew basket's going to be very wide, which means that your coffee bed will be very shallow. That shallow bed is going to be a problem, and it's going to get in the way of accomplishing all these things at once. So you need the appropriate bed depth, which is about 3 to 5 centimeters. And that's kind of overlooked. Like, even the best coffee shops I've ever been to in the world, like almost every time when they started batch brewing, I would walk into their shop and be like, that's a problem. And they were like, oh, that really fixed everything. Like, it's a huge thing, totally overlooked. The last thing I want to say about it is that one of the reasons a long total contact time is good is that if you can keep the grounds wet for a long time, to get to a certain extraction level, you're going to use a coarser grind. Not many people have probably ever thought about it this way, but at a certain extraction level, not with espresso, but with everything else, the coarser the grind, the better your coffee will taste. So if you can get to 20% with an even brew with one grind setting and with another grind setting, the coarser one's going to taste better. And it's going to taste better because the proportion of the coffee bed that is made up of fines, the little fine particles that always over-extract, the coarser grind is going to have less fines, fewer fines. And so therefore, in the mix of 20% extraction, you have less bitterness and less astringency with a coarser grind. Any questions on that? Does everyone want to think about that for a while? No? Callie, what do you think? Is that new information? Is it interesting?
I think that is interesting. I've known that before, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Marino Petracco, the lead researcher for Italy, I met him once for a glass of wine in New York many years ago, and I was so excited to meet this guy, right? And so for 1 hour, I asked him questions, and for every single question, he's like, I'm not allowed to tell you that. Right? Everything is proprietary. And I'm like, why did you meet me, you know? But the one thing he says, in his very thick accent, he's like, just anything that allows you to use a finer grind with espresso is good. And I was like, okay, I got my jewel. And he's right. Like, with espresso, going finer tends to be good. But with filter coffee, it's the opposite. Okay, so anything you can do to use a coarser grind with filter brewing. So, for instance, if your bed is too shallow in a batch brewer, you're going to be forced to use a finer grind to slow down the brew through the bed. So that's not going to taste as good as if you shrunk the diameter of the bed so that you get a deeper bed and a coarser grind to get the same, all the same numbers. Does that make sense? There should be somebody here who's scratching their head and says, I don't understand, because that's kind of messy. Yeah?
Is the water temperature also a way how to influence, in that case, the coarser grind?
Does it have more influence?
Would it be the way to influence the extraction, just making a higher water temperature and using coarser grind to extract more?
I see what you mean. I think the chemistry of like how water temperature affects coffee flavor is something that you shouldn't mess with too much. Like if you like the taste of, say, 93-degree water, like I wouldn't jack it up just to be able to use a coarser grind slightly. Like, it's not going to come out very good, because when you go above like 93, 94, you tend to get acrid and bitter flavors that wouldn't exist at, say, 92 or 93 or whatever the number might be. And so I wouldn't really mess with that. But it's a good point, but I wouldn't be my favorite thing. Yeah, some extra agitation sometimes allows you to use a coarser grind. There's a lot of things you can do, but anything that allows you to use a coarser grind and get a uniform brew, if you hit your numbers, it'll taste better with the coarser grind, basically. So, yes? Yeah, I mean, just because the machine says dripping, no, it doesn't mean, but, right. So basically, from the time you push the button till the time it finishes brewing, and then however long it takes before the flow breaks and goes drip, 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 that's your total contact time. So it's, yeah, but it's not necessarily related to the number on the screen, obviously, yeah. Yes?
Is a 3 to 5 centimeter bed depth something you recommend for immersion as well, or is it only for drip?
Totally irrelevant for immersion.
Okay, and do you know how the bed depth affect the extraction in immersion?
Assuming that you've agitated it to some degree and gotten, or at least poured the water in aggressively and gotten all the grounds to mix, it shouldn't really make a tangible difference.
Okay.
How the bed depth will affect, the only thing there is like, how do you get the liquid out of the immersion brew? How do you separate the liquid from the grounds? Then sometimes the shape or size of the bed is going to matter, but that's for another talk.
The depth of the bed is too important. Would the coffee at the bottom of the bed extract as much as the coffee on top if you don't stir it at any point?
If you poured the water incredibly gently and never stirred it, quite possibly. Yeah, that would be a terrible idea to find out, but just, And as a side note with immersion, this will ruffle a few feathers, but I like doing that. There is absolutely no point whatsoever. Am I making my point so far that I feel strongly about this? Okay.
I think so.
In doing any sort of pre-wet or pre-infusion with an immersion brew. Doesn't make sense. It actually hurts the uniformity of extraction, which I can explain over wine later or something. But if you're going to make an immersion brew, just dump all the water in at once. It'll actually make your extraction more even, because basically all the grounds are getting a crack at getting extracted by the water when the water is a good solvent, when it's very clean. If you just pour a little bit of water and let it soak in, some of the grounds will initially get wet with a liquid that's not a very good solvent.
So does that mean that if I'm making an AeroPress, I should just pour all the water at once quickly?
Pretty much. Yeah. Now, it's not to say, like with anything else, you might do it two ways. You might say, well, I like the other one better. But if you kind of get all your ducks in a row and figure everything out, eventually you won't be able to beat the one that went in all at once. But, yeah. Cool. Okay, two last things. This is what most coffee beds look like to some degree. It's hard to tell, but you'll see in a second that a lot of the grounds are kind of up the filter. This is kind of pretty typical, but what it should look like is more like that, is that the bed should be flat, it should be not quite as moist looking, and the walls should be relatively white. So again, lots of stuff on the walls, not so much stuff on the walls. Same batch size, same basket. Okay. Did I cram in lots of stuff in 1 hour? Was that okay?
Yeah,
right.
I think that was pretty cool.
All right.
Now we have 5 minutes for questions.
No, actually, I have one more thing to say. Sorry, I forgot about this one.
It's like Steve Jobs always did.
Exactly.
Oh, one more thing.
So when you are programming your batch brewer, this is totally counterintuitive. I've only met 5 people who ever kind of figured this out of the blue. And actually, I didn't know it myself. Vince Fideli taught me this years ago. When you do a larger batch, your brew time, the amount of time during which the water is dumping onto the grounds, should be shorter for a larger batch. And here's why. Is that short half batch, I'm making this up, but let's say the liquid takes 30 seconds to get through the coffee bed. Okay, if you're using the same basket, but you do now a double-sized batch, the bed is taller. It's going to take a lot longer for the liquid to get through it. So if you want to use the same ratio and the same grind to get the same extraction, the same TDS, et cetera, you need the same total contact time. And the way to do that is to make the brew a little faster with the large batch, so that, let's say, a 4-minute brew time plus the 1 minute that it takes to get through gives you a 5-minute contact time. With a smaller batch, you might go to 4:30 on your brew time, because your dwell time is only 30 seconds, and they both end up at a 5-minute total contact time, and they both will taste nearly identical. So, does anybody currently do that? Cool. Everybody should do that. And yet, almost everywhere I've ever been, the larger batches have more brew time on the screen, and that's a mistake. So, okay, questions?
Awesome.
Yes.
A small question regards this, the bed. If we do the same, for example, with Kalita, 500 mils or 250 mils, so the contact time should be, the same works with the manual brew?
It's much harder with a manual brew, because it's easy with the machine to just program it to pour slightly slowly or faster, but with a manual brew, you should aim for something similar, but it's not going to be as easy to nail it. You probably, with something like a Kalita or V60, just want to find a batch size that you feel best about and try to be consistent with that, rather than try to do too many different sizes. So, yeah. Where are we at? Callie? Yes. Oh, Tim.
The 3 to 5 centimeters, is that wet or dry?
Dry.
Okay.
Good question. Yes.
Oh, let's get it, we get it on the video when we ask it through the mic.
Well, hello.
Hi.
Hi. How do you feel about agitation with like, because some bulk brewers like have a thing where they can agitate it quite aggressively?
How do I feel about agitation?
How do you feel about it? It's not working well. Tell me your emotions.
Oh, okay. I was, I'm all for judicious agitation. I'm laughing because for years I was like, everybody should agitate, and like basically every barista in America told me I was an idiot, which was fine. That usually makes me feel good when all the Americans disagree with me. But basically, yes, agitation is good, especially if you're doing a manual brew. Like in the very beginning, you want all the grounds to get wet right away. If you don't agitate, sometimes some of the grounds will take, say, a full minute before they get wet. Well, that's a problem because that means that some grounds were wet and extracting 1 minute earlier than others. So you're basically guaranteeing an uneven extraction. So agitation, especially in the beginning, can really help you try to force all the grounds to get wet in a very short period of time with very similar solvents so that you can get closer to an even extraction. So, love agitation.
All right, I have a question. So you can achieve same extraction yield by grinding finer, having shorter brew time, and then having longer brew time and grinding coarser.
Correct.
Have you found, so you would prefer grinding coarser and having longer brew time?
Yes.
Why?
I find that if I do that blind and can kind of control everything carefully, that on average I find the coarser ones are, even though the extraction level is the same, it has less bitterness and astringency, presumably due to the presence of fewer fines. So.
Cool. Do we have more questions?
Hi. Could you come back to the slides with the flatbed and the...
Yep.
Yeah. So you told that the amount of the coffee is the same. And
Yes.
what are the difference between brewing parameters?
Really, this was just a finer grind, just to make the bed climb up the wall higher and then also drain slower.
All right.
Okay.
All right, let's give a big round of applause to Scott.